This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
Welcome to Spoonful of AI. I'm Carlos. I have with me Gavin Purcell. He's back.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, what's up, man?
Nothing much. Just continually amazed and crazed out by how AI has improves over time. It feels like 5 steps forward and then like 2 steps back. So we are progressing pretty quickly in a lot of ways.
It is interesting that you mentioned some steps back, because that is true. Like sometimes we'll see a new program or new tool and you're like, okay, well, that can do something that I've never seen before. But wait, it's worse at it.
Yeah. Part of the thing that's really tricky, I think, with the mainstream adoption of AI and how people see it is it's very easy to cherry pick things that it does wrong. And I think what happens then is the mainstream misses the 90% improvement across the board that it's had. And I think the cherry picking stops people from thinking that things are possible. And as far as I can tell, over the last year, all we've gotten is more possible things being done. And I think that, we're going to talk today a little bit about unifying some of those things under one model, which I think opens the door. But even with that, there's tons of people who are pointing out issues with it, right? So it's an important thing to kind of remember. None of this technology is right or directly answering all questions. And funny, Jensen Huang is giving his keynote today at what they call the GTC, which is like NVIDIA's big conference. And part of his talk is about we're going to be shifting the entire idea of what computing is from file-based to generative-based AI. And that is like, when you think about how large that is, even for a non-technical person, like that is about as big a shift as you can ever imagine in the world of computing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's going to be problems with it. You know what I mean? Of course, there's going to be problems with it. But like, that is a big, big problem to bite off and a whole new thing to think about. And I think we're so used to now these answers like coming to us. Like, I think the kind of social media revolution has provided us a lot of tools, better or for worse, that just work. And they're relatively simple things like sharing a picture or like writing a tweet. All of that stuff is very simple. And so like the tools themselves that we're going to be getting our hands on, or we're starting to get our hands on now, are much more complicated. So they're going to have problems along the way.
That's a great point, that we're so used to things just working. Like, here's the new thing. You can share it with all your friends and followers and blah, blah, blah. And it just works, right? But yeah, when you start digging down or making major changes to infrastructure of how things work, there's going to be a lot of things. Side note, you said like some social media things that are just easy. It's still difficult to make a GIF.
Yeah.
What
which you would
that?
think you think that would be something they could figure out. And that's like complicated because it's multi-step. You have to like first grab the frames of it. You then have to make it small enough so that it doesn't like become a shareable, 100 megabyte file. And all that stuff is like, you should be able to do that in one step, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and there's all these like bespoke websites that have started because of it. Some of which are like terrible places to go. Like you don't necessarily want to be there, but you're absolutely right. Like that's a good example of something that like you would have thought would have been solved. And by the way, you know what did solve that in a lot of ways is like Giphy solved it, because Giphy is a place where all that stuff lives. And most of the time you don't need to make one. You just grab one that's already been made. Right. And so like, that's the example of like, okay, well, we've taken this kind of problem, which is not very easy, and we've just created this giant database of places where you can grab one rather than make it yourself. And like, that feels like a solution. And obviously on Giphy itself, it is a step through process that you can do, but it's still not easy there even.
Yeah. And I remember using Imgur, which is still a site and still a thing. And because I do a lot of gaming content as well, and trying to make just a gaming clip that was a GIF, still difficult because, Giphy or other sites will like convert it for you, and that's lucky. But if you want it yourself, or like to try to make a small file, it's impossible. So we can't even figure that out. But let's talk about AI because maybe we can figure that out. So my main topic for today is just, I saw Google Studio come out. I know you messed with it. I got access as well. And just kind of plugging around in there, I have a couple major issues. One being the image generation's using an older model. So it's using Gemini 2, and I'm using Gemini 3 normally, right? With my other account. And that's producing some amazing things, actually. So I love Gemini 3, kind of used to that. Went over to Gemini 2 to be like, okay, what's the new thing here? Which is essentially an all-in-one place where you can do many things, including, hey, help me with the story itself. Like, I want to create a story, help me write that, but then also provide images. And it's using this Imagen 2 model, which is not as good. So
Yeah.
while I did it and it did produce some interesting results, it made me just more question about this idea of a one studio to rule them all. And I think we talked about it even last episode. What are your new thoughts on this? When you see Google Studio come out, you go, okay, that's Google. And this is an experiment, right? So it's not a full, true launch.
Yeah.
But can we get to that place? Will we get to that place where Meta, one of the companies, Google, or just an indie company that just does it better, creates this truly, one place?
I mean, okay, so I think this whole thing, somebody just was messaging me as to like, I just saw a tweet about somebody, AI Warper, who I like on Twitter, who does a lot of fun experiments, was talking about how Stable Diffusion had just come out with something that looks like tools like almost everything else, right? And that like, how many of these things do we need essentially? And in my mind, what you're looking at here are, I think, probably 7 to 10 companies, if you want to kind of include all the extra little ones, that are all trying to get to what you're talking about, which is this idea that like you would go to one place and do all of the work you would need to do. In this case, image generation, but also text and everything else. And what's different about this new Google model is that it's truly multimodal, and it's the first multimodal image-based model, or sorry, model that has image generation within it that we've really been able to play with for the first time, right? And this was what was promised by OpenAI way last summer. They were supposedly going to update their GPT model with this image generation stuff too, and they still haven't. The thing that's really interesting to me, and you're right, like the Imagen 2 is part of it, not Imagen 3, so you're not getting as good of output of the video of the images themselves. But again, the thing that, to get back at like the idea of like what people want out of this, like I did a thing, we have a newsletter that just comes out every Tuesday morning, and I just did something this morning to kind of illustrate this. I took a picture of my headshot and I said like, put me in Miami Beach with a tropical shirt on. And the shot that I use for my headshot is like a shot of me on stage talking with a kind of a sport coat and a normal shirt. And, it's not perfect, but it did it in one shot and it looks pretty good, right? Like, and I think this is the case that like, if you can essentially start to manipulate images in a way that is believable and feels really interesting, that does start to open the door to all sorts of other things. Because you know this about like Photoshop, right? If you try to go into Photoshop, the idea of like a normal person being able to simply do that, remove the background, change the look, do all this stuff in one shot, it takes a while, right? And even if you're a Photoshop expert, that's like a 10-minute job maybe to do it right and do it well. So I think that is the interesting thing of this, is like what it looks like to be able to do a fully multimodal interaction with images and text. So in this case, I could have gone in and said, okay, I like the shirt, but I don't like the background. Pick a picture, pick a different picture of Miami, and it would do it. Now,
Right.
the caveat here is like, it's not perfect at it yet. In fact, one of the things that we also shared in the newsletter is like Kevin, my co-host, had a very funny picture where he like tried to get a image of, putting an image in a headshot, and what it did is it removed his eyeballs. So it's this really scary image of like Kevin without eyeballs, like skin over the eyes, and like it's
Yikes.
not perfect. Yeah, it's not perfect at it yet, and that's where you're going to see a lot of people stumble here, because I think a lot of people, to our point before, don't have the patience to deal with a tool that isn't there yet, which is why I think they've launched it as an experiment. Probably why also they're using the older image model. They're trying to figure their way through this. And of course, we also know that Google has had major issues with like, their whole diverse presidents conversation and all that sort of stuff. So if you weren't following that, there was a whole kerfuffle last year where Google released an image generator that allowed you to make the founding fathers pictures, and they were all coming out as diverse, which, I think from an intention wise, I understand what they were trying to get at. It was a huge kerfuffle because obviously American founding fathers were not diverse, and that became a big thing. Google as a company is running into a lot of that stuff. But I think to the point of why this is important, I think ultimately there will be maybe 2 or 3 winners in the overall AI space. And one of the biggest winning platforms will be is like, is this the place you do all your work with? Is this the chatbot that you end up doing this stuff within? And I really do think what's interesting about where Google is, because we've crapped on Google's kind of like AI like pathway for a while on our show. And I think in part it has to do with bad branding. In part it also has to do with how large the company is and how many different pathways they were going down at the same point, really kind of parallel pathways with different teams. Google is now, I think, making a point to say, we are at the cutting edge. We're trying things that other people aren't trying. And I think because of their, excuse me, I think because of their huge platform. I mean, Google's user platform is massive, right? In the billions of users. They have a real shot to be this kind of one all kind of take. Now you've got also GPT, you got ChatGPT, which is obviously crushing in terms of user base. You've got Anthropic trying to do this too, and Meta. Those are the four that I keep an eye on that could really kind of pull this off in some way. But to me, that's what's really interesting about this new image model. It's not like yet how amazing the experience of it is. It's not like that every iteration of it is perfect. I think it's more about the step towards this world where your LLM, your interaction with the LLM, is including photos, video, conceivably
Yeah.
soon
Yeah.
location, like search, all that stuff in one place. So it's like an answer box that you go to all the time.
Yeah, I think that is, well, two things. One, the chatting ability is huge because like right now
Yep.
I use Ideogram still, I use Minimax, I use probably like five, different softwares.
Me too.
And all of them have different things, but I don't think any of them have the ability to go, hey, that's cool, but can you change it a little bit? You have
Yes.
the remix function, which is in a lot of different creators, which says, hey, take this, make it slightly different, and then I'll edit it afterwards, which,
Yeah,
by
it's
the
a
way,
slot machine though, right? Like
it's a
you
slot
never
machine.
know what you're going to get out of that, and
Yeah,
often it changes a part of the image you don't want, which is a big
exactly.
problem when you're trying to make stuff.
Yeah. And then you have to it's based on sliders, right? And that's
Yeah.
like unreliable. And yet somehow, and we'll look back at this just like we look back at like us playing old school video games or something, being like, how do we even do that? They were like,
Yeah,
no
exactly.
graphics. But
Yeah.
it's the same kind of thing where I make it work, or you, both of us make it work, and we use the sliders, and then we go into Photoshop or we do what we need to do. But so I think chatting, the ability to go back and forth with it will be the winner, the kind of like end game. But I'm interested in how you mentioned four companies, right? We talk about the big companies, but so many of these smaller companies are like so fast, right? We always talk about companies that are small can be agile and really quickly maneuver and change and pivot. And then, of course, you have China, which is another part of this
Yeah, sure, of
conversation.
course.
Because
Yeah.
when we said four companies, we weren't talking about
No,
China.
you're right.
And
They probably left out the deep seeks of the world,
the deep
which is
seek,
going
and
to be a
also
big,
for me,
and
it's like
Baidu.
Minimax.
Yeah. Yeah.
Minimax is
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
The stuff I'm doing with them and the way that they're taking all data, they're like, their filters are pretty much very little, and it just lets you learn more. I mean, that the ability that I can do right now with video in their newest model with the
Mm-hmm.
Rector as well is like movie quality. Like I'm finally hitting
Sure.
a scene that feels just straight up like, if nothing messed up, or if I cut it out with Premiere so you don't see it, the hands, you're like, okay, well, there you go. That's kind of what
Yeah.
we were trying this whole time. So you have them, they kind of come in, the Chinese companies, and then you have all the small companies. So I still don't know. I think a healthy marketplace is great, right? We want competition. But I think that you are right in the like, just the general point of like having a one place to do it all. I think for the average person is what they want, because they don't want to have to open Photoshop,
Yeah.
and all the other tools.
And also, I mean, that's like the question is like, what market are you going for, right? Because in the world of creators, there will always be hardcore creation tools, I think. Like, I think when you think about people who want to make things that look like feature films, there will be tool sets for those people, and they will cost money, and they will be businesses that'll be really good. It's really kind of almost like two parallel pathways, right? I think really where the huge value unlock lives in the ChatGPT LLM world is, do you get your users locked into using your systems, and can you then leverage them for value, right? Which is it sounds like a kind of a dirty capitalist thing, but like that's what all these companies are attempting to do. And like while Meta is out there like kind of open sourcing or trying to open source all their models, the reason why they're doing that is because they think, well, if we open source these models, people will be able to use them for free, and then we'll get more users, right? Like that's really what it comes down to. So what I think will be interesting on the hardcore creation side is, I like Minimax a lot too, and I think Kling, a lot of the Chinese models are very good. I really think then the question becomes is like, I think probably you and I would say like, if there was a unified model that could do all this and allow me to like make edits in video clips with LLM. Like if I said like, I love this video except for
Ugh,
do the explosion again, right? Do the
love
explosion
it.
again. But probably pay a lot of money for something like that, right? Like, and that's where you can probably see a significant value being created in this space. And to we're going to talk a little bit about ComfyUI, and like one of the interesting things that happens in the open source world is like all of these tools that find their way back into the mainstream models are often based on these open source kind of like interesting things that get released, whether it's through ComfyUI, which is like a very dense and interesting world of like using these open source tools in different ways, or even like what Pika does. Like Pika's like, additions or all the stuff that they've integrated are all based on like open source technology tools, and they've just found ways to bring them to consumers. I think that's an interesting space. Is if you think about the hardcore creator, there's probably a multimodal engine that will allow you to do the sorts of things that Google is attempting here with Flash image gen, but at a much denser level. And I think people will probably pay a lot for that. That probably will be like a unique tech stack that they will have to figure out some way to either piece it all together.
Mm.
And this goes back to like why I think these smaller companies are in a little bit of a difficult space. And Peak is one of these. Ultimately, to get the tech right, it's very expensive, right? To get the tech right. And I think that like, Minimax is a good example of a company that's gotten very good at making video model tech. And then the question is, do they have the ability to have an LLM that they can bake into that? Do they have the kind of two pieces to put together? Because Google does, right?
Yeah,
Google
they do.
has cutting edge LLM. They've got cutting edge video. They've got cutting edge image. They can piece all those together. So that's where like those companies may be SOL a little bit. But, I think there's a world where one of them could win that game. And, I think Adobe's trying to be that company. I'm not sure, if Firefly is the answer, but
Firefly,
like, I
yeah.
think that, yeah, they're trying,
Yeah, the Firefly is interesting in the fact that, and that kind of dovetails nicely into that, because that's that. Okay, we know where all the sources are from
Yeah.
for this model, but at the same time, it's not as good. So,
No.
um, well, let's just jump real quick because you mentioned Comfy, and I wanted to talk about them for a little bit, or that workflow, the workflow, the workflow. So in this, and I think let me jump back real quick. I think you brought up a good point that I often forget, especially on this show, is that I am and you are the more the hardcore content creators, and
Yeah.
there's another chunk of people, which is a huge number, that don't need all these bells and whistles that you and I want. So there is that kind of other world of like who will solve for AI's just generalized use,
Right.
right?
Well, it's also, by the way, speed to creation. Like, I mean, just yesterday, I don't know if you saw this, but I made a video where I just basically only used Hydra's tool and
Oh
then
yeah,
didn't edit. And to me, like, it's not great. And I did it in like an hour, right? So I did it very fast. But like, there's something about that workflow, even for hardcore creatives, that's important because, like, yes, you might want to spend 8 weeks like the AI for Video guys did on their new video, Karen, which everybody should go watch. It's a very funny fake trailer, or you might just want to try something for an hour and see if it hits, right? And like this is the differentiation, I think, even for hardcore creator type people.
yeah. Oh man, don't get me started on Hydra though, because yeah, again, that's one of those in between moments where the lip sync is almost there. It's almost
Yeah,
there.
yeah. So
Um,
close.
so speaking of other ways you can do AI, obviously for a very long time there's been this kind of local model, which for people who don't know, you can obviously run your own AI programs on your own computer to kind of keep it simple. And then there's lots of different workflows that are set up that allow you to process this information. I'm very bad at explaining this version, the local version, but one of the tools is called ComfyUI, and it's well known, and people love using it because it allows for a lot of like plug and play of different filters. You can take different models, LoRa's, which are basically a creation of kind of how would you describe a LoRa?
Allura is a unique set of data visually that allows you to fine tune a model to only produce that sort of specifically face or type of visual, right? Like so, like
Yeah,
there's a Allura, you can train a Allura on a specific face, you can train a Allura on a specific visual type. It's a kind of a smaller model that allows you to kind of butt it up against a bigger model and have the output only be with that.
that's what I meant. There you go. That's what I meant to say. So with this workflow that you can do on your machine, in general, you need a pretty hefty PC. You need some good VRAM, and
or working in the cloud in some form, like
or
on a
working in the
run pod
cloud
or
like
something.
Mimic PC, and you can basically just rent a PC online. But what's interesting is even with the most, in quotes, powerful, I think, versions of these local stuff, it seems like I still hit a wall. If you are running it locally, it takes a very long time for a very short, output, especially if you're doing video. I messed with the 2.1 or whatever and got I got 4 seconds. I got 4 seconds of a video and it's wrong, after 5 minutes or something. So my point is I'm just always baffled by Comfy because this workflow idea where people put in filters, they put in these modules, and it all seems so cumbersome and so watch a million YouTube videos just so I can get one thing done. And then the creativity, by the way, speaking as a creator, goes right out the window because I'm so tired already, by like just getting this damn thing to work to get close to my realization of what I was trying to do and why I use cloud-based models and Minimax and stuff like that. But I guess there really is no question, but I guess I want to know your experience with that whole world.
This goes to what I was saying before, is that like I don't find it worth it, and I know that if I had endless hours and I would had an endless ability to kind of start this up. I mean, this goes all the way back to like a year and a half ago when I was first really experimenting with a lot of this AI stuff. Like I spent a lot of time working in ComfyUI type things, originally working in like the OG Stable Diffusion 1.5 world, which allowed you to kind of make uncensored stuff and you could run it locally or you could run it in the cloud. And to be honest with you, it became a very heavy burden. And I think the reason why this is something that it reminded me a lot of, and this still does remind me, ComfyUI reminds me a lot. I'm old enough to remember this, but I wasn't that young. I wasn't that old then, but of the early kind of like PC modding, even before that, like in the old school, like early computer days where people were making bespoke software to do specific things. And it would be like this whole kind of hacking community behind the scenes, which by the way is super awesome. And I think if people really love that sort of stuff, like it's a very cool thing to do. I think ultimately the tools now are at a place where the value is still there. If you make a really great ComfyUI pipeline and you can make stuff out of it, sure, that's great. But then the question is, to your point, Minimax, which kind of gives you outputs that are pretty close to uncensored, or maybe not uncensored, but like you can do stuff you can't do with the American stuff, or in some ways, is that not close enough? And where does that stop your creativity level? And for me, to your point, I believe my creativity level gets crushed if I'm spending multiple days or at least multiple hours trying to figure out technically how to connect something. I don't even do it anymore. And I know that some people will be like, that's blasphemy or whatever, but like to me, it's really not worth it. And I guess if you're really trying to create like, very, skimpy booba girls, and you're trying to do the sort of stuff that like you really can't get out of a mainstream model, I understand it. But even people like the Door Brothers who are doing very kind of edgy, creative stuff, that's where I think even the Chinese models allow you to do things like that for better or for worse. I think the one thing that I keep coming back to that is trickier to do, which, may or may not be a bad idea to make it tricky, is using images of real people to do things, right? Which is what the Door Brothers do, right? Like they take pictures of Biden, or they take a picture of Trump, or they take a picture of Vladimir Putin, and they make videos with those guys. That, like, you still do need some sort of kind of off the shelf, like whether it's a face swap thing to be able to do kind of locally so that you can get it done. So that's the one area where I think probably you're stuck a little bit trying to figure out these open source tools. But other than that, ultimately, like, I think we're going to get to a place where these mainstream tools will allow you to do all the stuff you might want to do. For me, like the big thing is like I want character consistency, which still isn't perfect, but like it's getting there, right?
It's elusive. It's elusive.
Yeah. But that will get solved, I feel like. Now, it's character consistency, but you're not going to be able to use like, Elon throughout everything, because there's a reason why they don't want you to do that. And I understand that reason in some form or another.
But I don't want to use Elon.
Yeah.
But
You want that's what I mean. You want to use your original character, which and then in that case, like it really did you see there's a really great video that this guy Kai, who I've shouted out before, shared in our Discord, but also has publicly shared where he used this new Google system to kind of do a front and end frame for a full kids animation show. And what was interesting about that is using this new Google system, he was able to get like a character. He was able to get a character, which I think in this instance was like a little kitty, like kind of a Pixar looking kitty. Throughout the whole thing, there was character consistency. And that's one thing that conceivably these multimodal kind of unified models can do is they will understand, oh, that's the character the user's talking about. And I want to bring that thing through. That feels like a pretty big win if it can work.
It was also a kitty, though, just to put an asterisk.
No, sure. But, it's like, I think ultimately there will have to be a solution for a person, right? There will have to be some sort of a solution. Yeah.
But I can understand the complexity because when you make someone who looks really, really realistic, like I've done, there's so many points to remember on that facial feature, right? Yeah. And so just mathematically, I get why it's difficult. I'm not saying that, but, and then really quickly to close on the Comfy thing, the only thing that I just want to like stand on the soapbox for 30 seconds and say is the idea with SD or Stable Diffusion and all that stuff, in the very beginning, 111, all that, or 1111 or something. Yeah. And Comfy, I just don't know who originally was the programmer or programmers who wrote the idea of that language because it's just math. It's like blah, 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 parentheses, dot. And I'm like, no one's going to do this. Like, for the short term, it might be a fun, nerdy hacking thing. I used to hack PC stuff, did hexadecimal editors. I get it.
Sure.
But it's still to this day, I went back to Comfy. The whole reason I want to talk about it. And I was like, the language is still messed up. It's like,
I mean, again, it's like, it's not designed for users first, right? I mean, it's designed for all AI stuff was code. Still is code, right? And like that's the original image generation was all based around code. And like what I found really, because you're talking about like automatic 1111, I think was the original front end for Stable Diffusion, right? Just the idea of how the prompts you had to prompt it, right? Like the prompts were themselves like this language that you had to learn. And to me, that's the biggest win that a company like Ideogram has figured out, or Midjourney, all these companies, they kind of rewrite your prompt a little bit. But even when they're rewriting it, they're not rewriting it in that crazy way that you have to write your Stable Diffusion prompts. And remember how many negative prompts you would have to put in and all that sort of stuff. So I think that is a win for users at large. And I do think all of that stuff will eventually sit behind, and probably does already at Ideogram and these companies, behind a wall, right? Where the user doesn't have to necessarily engage with it. And that's in some ways the problem with Comfy is that like Comfy's still the ground factory. Like you're trying to put the pieces together on your own. Yeah. And nobody has built kind of a UX around it. I mean, the Comfy is a UX, but like nobody has built like the usable UX that kind of makes sense for the average person.
Which makes me always, like when I went back to it, like searching for workflows, which are
which is a nightmare because then you spend half your time doing it. I mean, I remember in YouTube, there's a guy that we followed early on who I think now is only behind a paywall. I can't remember his name, but anyway, he was like how I learned to do all that early Stable Diffusion stuff. I don't care about that anymore. I know that sounds shitty in some ways to a lot of people, but like to me, I would rather spend my time coming up with funny and creative things to do with it. And again, going back to like that Karen video by AI or Die, who I really appreciate what those guys do. They spent 8 weeks on that video, but really when you look at the tools they used VO2, they use Kling, they use 11 Labs, they used a lot of stuff that's just off the shelf. And that is as good of a creative video as I've seen to date around like what you can do with AI video.
Yeah. Well, at some point we'll find a thing that, brings it all together, and it will probably be a big company, and it might come from China. Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows?
Gavin, thanks for being here. And everybody check out AI for Humans. It's an amazing podcast and show.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see you, Carlos.
Nice to see you. And we'll talk more about AI soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? And don't forget to give us a 5-star review. You'll find more content like this on thespoon.tech/podcasts.